The third episode of the Outer Limits series, titled The Architects of Fear, involved a group of eminent scientists facing the imminent nuclear holocaust. In hopes of staving off an apocalyptic military confrontation between nations, they stage a fake invasion of Earth by an extraterrestrial power in an effort to unite all of humanity against a perceived common enemy. To represent the attacking species, the scientists effect biological transformations on one of their own, Dr. Alan Layton, using genetic material from a rather small and unimposing alien life form already in their possession. The transformed Dr. Layton is launched into orbit with plans to land his craft in the United Nations Plaza. Of course, in the grand tradition of Greek tragedy and Shakespearean drama, the plan goes awry. The spaceship fails to perform as expected, and the fearful hunters that find Dr. Layton in a New Jersey swamp fatally wound him. The story concludes with the pregnant widow of this sacrificial lamb castigating the other scientists for their thoughtless inhumanity. The show ends with the following control voice narration. Scarecrows and magic and other fatal fears do not bring people closer together. There is no magic substitute for soft caring and hard work, for self-respect and mutual love. If we can learn this from the mistake these frightened men made, then their mistake will not merely have been grotesque, it would at least have been a lesson at last to be learned. I love the juxtaposed phrases here, so let me repeat one sentence. There is no magic substitute for soft caring and hard work, for self-respect and mutual love. This language reminds me of another voice from that era, that of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he described the beloved community. King envisioned a completely integrated society, a community of love and justice in which men and women would live in true equality and peace in all aspects of social life. Who are the architects of fear today, whether malicious or benign? For I believe both exist. Our news media, and with the passage last year of icon Walter Cronkite, displays the demise of journalism today. We have dozens of news outlets of marginal quality from which to choose, most owned and controlled by the same corporations with their own agendas as to what constitutes news. Our government, which continues to engage in questionable military agendas, adventures against alleged enemies whose origins often lie within our own attempts at economic control or geopolitical domination. Our system of law enforcement, which after the sad arrest and treatment of Henry Louis Gates in Boston last year, reminds us that it remains a rich and viable culture for sustaining racial bias and judicial double standards. Our overburdened educational system, asked to do more tasks and fulfill more oversight requirements with fewer resources every year. Our medical establishment, which produces mammoth profits for the few and inadequate care for the many. And our organized religions, which preach rigid adherence to ancient views, often with divisive and violent results. And lest we feel too comfortable among these indictments, we also shoulder some of the responsibility for this design work. For every time we fail to speak up against oppression, or every time that we quietly acquiesce to systematic power dynamics, we sign our own names to that blueprint as fellow architects of fear. Who, then, are the architects of the beloved community? Who will craft our architecture of hope? First, let us look to our own history. Nearly 5 centuries ago, the Protestant Reformation elicited waves of violence among people of differing religious belief. In Poland, one group seeking asylum from the violence created the Minor Reformed Church, later known as the Polish Brethren. A woman named Jadwiga Gnońska persuaded her husband to obtain the necessary charter to form a new town, where religious toleration would be guaranteed. Rakowia immediately attracted many people of liberal Christian belief. Rakowia became the center not only of the Polish Brethren, but of great scholarly activity. A school was established that trained over 1,000 students. A printing press later produced a constant flow of books and tracts. One seminal publication, the Rakowian Catechism, refuted the Christian doctrine of original sin as a founding precept of salvation. Baptism was described as a merely symbolic gesture and not a requirement for either infants or adults. Communion was reduced from its sacramental status to that of a common meal, perhaps accompanied by preaching and prayer. And finally, the Rakowian Catechism denied the right of a church institution to exercise authority over individuals, and that a church exists wherever truths are accepted and expounded. Unfortunately, religious violence continued in Europe and began in Poland. Fighting between Catholics and Protestants broke out regularly, and the Polish Senate eventually ordered the Rakowian school and press closed. Residents were given 4 weeks to leave their homes in exile. After 7 decades, the Rakowian experiment ended. But the legacy lived on in the Catechism and other writings, influencing people from the philosopher John Locke to Thomas Jefferson. An example of the intentional beloved community from the 19th century derived from the work of Universalist and Unitarian minister Aidan Ballou. Ballou believed in temperance, abolition, and a form of pacifism called Christian nonviolence. The signatories of his Standard of Practical Christianity announced their withdrawal from the governments of the world that used force to maintain order. Ballou came to believe that practical Christians were called to make their convictions a reality and should begin to fashion a new civilization. After studying other utopian community plans, Ballou and others began to design their own community. In 1841, they purchased a farm and christened it Hopedale.